You know ID in the town all day. ID in the SEA. You know ID in the town all day. ID in the SEA.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Fabulous Pelton Cast. I'm your co-host Kevin Pelton,
Tristan Carcino.
and we are joined by Ben Baldwin, his third Pelton brother, today to help us discuss the most important news in Seattle sports. Troy Fautanu is headed to the NFL. Now, somehow, I'm completely shocked, even though barely 12 hours ago, in this same spot on this very podcast, I said Pete Carroll said he planned on coming back. The Seahawks didn't say they planned on Pete Carroll coming back. And we learned Wednesday morning that they do not plan on him coming back as head coach, as he has transitioned to an advisor role. And I should do the air quotes, an advisor role instead. After 14 seasons with the Seahawks, Tristan, you spoke this into existence. What are your thoughts this morning?
The power of the retire bitch is quite wild, because if Jim Harbaugh also comes here, Jim Harbaugh leaves Michigan, then we'll know something's really going down. Dan Lanning, he got it twice. But if Dan Lanning is the next head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, we'll know the power. I was literally on a Zoom talking about digital ads and reactive market analysis. And you said in the chat, you said WTF and a thing from Adam Schefter. And I was like running through my brain. I was like, I know this is something big. And finally, I just like picked up my phone underneath the Zoom camera and looked at it. And I was like, I appreciate what you're saying. This is in my head. I didn't say this out loud, but I was like, I appreciate what you're saying about digital ads in Prague or whatever, but I cannot think about anything else in this moment. So it was shocking to me, to be honest. I mean, I told you literally 12 hours ago that Pete Carroll was coming back. This was something that I didn't think organizationally that they were willing to move on from Pete Carroll at this time. But Ben, we only have you for 15 minutes, so I want to hear your thoughts right now.
Yeah, I was also very surprised. It's one of those things where something is there for so long that you never really think about that it could ever change. And I didn't think they would move on from him. That seems like a very large change to make with at some point, presumably the team's ownership is going to have to change hands, right? So what I kind of expected was that it would just kind of go on like this. The team wasn't that bad. They finished with a winning record, although not in the most impressive fashion in their last game. And you can point to all these young players to maybe talk yourself into being optimistic. And the ownership group has been very patient with this team as they've had the same coach for a long time. So like Tristan, I was in remote desktop writing code, and suddenly every Discord, Slack, text message, like everything that could ring started ringing. And I was like, okay, hey, I'm going to minimize this and see what the heck is going on. And then you do the thing with the Adam Schefter, make sure this is the actual account with 10 million followers and not some fake Adam Schefter. And then I was like, okay, wow, we really are going to have to think about what is next, which I think is kind of exciting. And then 30 seconds later, I saw that Dan Quinn is going to be considered very strongly for the next head coach. And now my excitement is gone.
That was it.
I discovered it in the most amusing fashion possible. I was writing about the Kawhi Leonard contract extension that was announced this morning. So I was on Woj's Twitter account looking through his tweets reporting that move, and he had retweeted Schefter about Pete Carroll. So it was on Woj's page that I got the Schefter bomb. I guess let's start with, like, Ben, you've obviously wanted this change for a period of time, going back to when it seemed like, and it surely was, a choice between Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll. Like, did you ride the Pete coaster this season? You know, it was, we talked about how short recently it was. We were saying we didn't think he was going to get fired. It was also not that long ago that we were enjoying, the video of can you win the game in the first quarter, et cetera, after the Eagles game. Did you ride it this season? Was there a point where you wanted to keep Pete Carroll as coach, or were you always ready for a change?
I think I have been ready for a change, but not to the point where like I couldn't enjoy the enjoyable moments of the season. And as we'll review eventually, coming into the season, I was somewhat optimistic about the Seahawks and especially their offense. And I think a lot of that bore out, and they were a fun team to watch on one side of the ball at times, or for most of the time. And they weren't a miserable team to watch. They had their moments of frustration that you guys have covered extensively on the podcast after some of these games, like the most recent Steelers loss, which in hindsight is probably what ended up dooming his tenure here. So yeah, I was ready for change, but we'll see the extent to which change is actually happening. If it's a Mike Vrabel, if it's a Dan Quinn, then I don't know. Yes, it's a different person with a different approach, but I could see our annoyances being the same annoyances going forward, which would be kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, this is a point that you've made on the podcast before, is that when you have a defensive-minded head coach, that you're reliant on finding a strong offensive coordinator to be good on that side of the ball, and then they potentially can be promoted, although that's something that never happened in the entire Seahawks era, kind of amusingly. And then, the you don't necessarily guarantee yourself strong defenses with a defensive minded head coach. I think that's probably what ultimately did Pete Carroll in. If you want to talk bigger picture than that Steelers loss specifically, it was the same thing that we were frustrated about, that you've made all these changes, you keep shuffling through defensive coordinators and players, and the results are the same. And as you've noted, Dan Quinn's Atlanta defenses were not very good. And when they won, it was because of Kyle Shanahan's offense and Matt Ryan.
Yeah, I think it's really I think flaw is maybe too strong, but like the false premise of a coaching search is you go and you look for a team that has a good defense and you say, I'm going to hire this defensive coach and he's going to make my defense good. And the Chargers are like cherry picking a very strong example of this not working out for them, where they had Brandon Staley's defense was very good when he had Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey, and it was very bad with the Chargers. And that's what worries me about Dan Quinn, for example, where his defenses were not good in Atlanta, but he goes to a team that just drafted Micah Parsons, and they've been very good. And that's even if we're not talking about the like coaches that have had head coach experience, like your Vrabel or Dan Quinn, someone like Mike McDonald of the Ravens, who's gotten a lot of head coaching buzz. He's younger. A lot of people are very excited about him. And I get it to some extent, but if the primary reason for looking at him as a candidate in the first place is, oh, their defense is really good, so he must be a good coach, I don't think we've seen evidence that that is actually a good process for hiring your next coach.
I think the premise is that Michigan's defense was very good.
I think what you're relying on is the things that we know to be true is that offense is more consistent year to year than defense. Defense is generally inconsistent from year to year. And I think if we were to extrapolate that or whatever, defense is probably a little bit more reliant on players, and offense is probably a little bit more reliant on scheme. Does that seem fair?
I think that might even oversell it or undersell it. Sorry. I think it's a lot easier to see tangible, repeated benefits of offensive coaches with these schemes where, yes, the 49ers have a lot of talent, but every year that they have a healthy quarterback, they have a great offense. And we've seen the Dolphins have an elevated offense once they got their new coach. And even like the Packers have been very happy with their offensive-minded coach. And talent matters on both sides of the ball, but I think the degree to which scheme might matter is just so much more noticeable on the offensive side, where the defense, it seems like it's just so much about players and so much about who your opponents happen to be.
Do we want to talk about specific candidates for a little bit here? You've gone on the record is endorsing Eagles offensive coordinator Ben Johnson.
Lions.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, Eagles have Ryan Johnson. Yes, who is being interviewed by the Panthers, but I don't think is your endorsement.
Yeah, the quote unquote film people seem impressed with him. Whenever I watch the Lions, they seem like they definitely know what they are doing. Their offensive line it's very good this year, but I don't think it was that great, at least in pass protection last year. And he and together with Jared Goff, I thought did a good job of mitigating that. And that might be a situation that the Seahawks find themselves in if their struggles this year continue going forward. And other than him, I don't know how many guys from the offensive side are getting that much buzz this year. It seems like him and then a ton of defensive guys.
Yeah, that was the thing that made me nervous about this. We'll talk about Pete Carroll and what he meant to the organization once Ben's gone. We'll have the cold heartless. Let Ben have the cold heartless conversation. But the Ben Johnson, you would assume that he's taken some of the fourth down aggressiveness from Dan Campbell, because we've seen that, right? He also, the way that you're able to make a defense good is by finding talent that isn't necessarily, you don't have to invest a high draft pick in. Amon-Ra St. Brown was third round pick, I think. Jared Goff was included in the deal, but they've turned those two players into Amon-Ra is a superstar caliber wide receiver, and Jared Goff is a playoff caliber quarterback who is basically being cast off. They did invest pretty heavily in the offense this draft, but they didn't necessarily need to. Like the difference between them having Jahmyr Gibbs and them not having Jahmyr Gibbs probably wasn't the playoffs or not this season. So I'm sure he was helpful. But by finding those players and not having to invest all of your resources there and being able to go out and find players who you might be able to get later on in the draft or something like that, and then being able to invest heavily in resources for defensive players, that's kind of how you make this work. And it's similar to the Chiefs obviously lucked into Patrick Mahomes, but like the Chiefs have done this and they've invested over and over and over again in their defense to the point now that their defense might even be better than their offense is.
I mean, you look at the track record in Detroit. So Anthony Lynn was the offensive coordinator under Dan Campbell. The first year that Jared Goff was there, they were 29th in offensive DVOA. They improved to 7th in Johnson's first year, 5th this season. So that's a pretty dramatic year-over-year turnaround. The personnel got better. St. Brown was going into his second season, but I think definitely, you can see why he would get a lot of credit schematically for that. How do you feel about the idea of, and it seems unlikely, but how would you feel about Jim Harbaugh?
There's the awkward silence here. It's just it is hard to look past like how everywhere he has gone, he has turned them around. So here's my Stanford bias speaking to some degree, where Stanford is usually horrible. They were horrible before he got there. He came in, he dramatically turned the program around, and then he left. It was kind of a slow decline afterwards. We saw the same thing with the 49ers, and now Michigan again. I think it's a lot easier to do it in college, where recruitment is such a big part of it, and you are able to place yourself on unequal footing with other teams, where it's a lot harder in the NFL, where you have the same salary cap and the same access to draft picks and the same everything. So
I'm going to also note here, though, I don't mean to defend Jim Harbaugh because he's been a Pelton Cast foil for many years, including this week. But one of the, Stanford wasn't recruiting at the caliber that they were playing. And one of the points about Michigan this last week is that Michigan, 5-star talent-wise, is nowhere near the level of Alabama, who they beat, Ohio State, who they beat. They're closer to Washington than they are the elite level teams. Yes, Jim Harbaugh has been a good recruiter, but he's been a better developer of players at slightly lower talent.
Yep, I think that's fair. The other question I would have about him would be whether, and we saw it work with the 49ers, but whether he really wants to run the ball and play that. It's almost like hiring a defensive-minded coach where he just wants to run all over teams. And obviously that worked in Stanford and Michigan, and the running games were really good. And even the 49ers when they had Colin Kaepernick. But is that a recipe for success in this version of the NFL? I am a little skeptical, and that's why if I had to pick, I would pick Ben Johnson. And then the other one we forgot to mention was Bobby Slowick, who's the offensive coordinator for the Texans. He's the other offensive side of the ball, Shanahan influence, young coach that has been getting some buzz too.
Yeah, he's already scheduled to interview for some jobs, including Carolina's. I think the interesting thing about Harbaugh, and this is kind of a contrast to Carroll, is I had a conversation about this with a friend of the pod, Dan Feldman, who also said that, he wants Michigan to keep Harbaugh. He would absolutely love listening to the Pelton Cast about the Seahawks hiring Jim Harbaugh. That they rethought things, brought in outside coordinators ahead of the 2021 season, including Mike Macdonald before he went to the Ravens. And that's what took them from a team that was, good. They were winning 10 games a year most seasons to in the playoff the last 3 years. And that's the transition that I think Pete Carroll has not been able to make these past few years, to kind of objectively take a step back and say, what we're doing isn't working. We need a pretty dramatic overhaul.
On the defensive side of the ball.
Right. Yeah. Offensively, it wasn't necessary. So
just out of curiosity, how would you guys feel if it were Shane Waldron?
I mean, I think offensively it's amusing because, again, Seahawks fans seem to want to get him fired, and everyone else in the tape world in particular seemed to think the Seahawks were running amazing stuff. I like how well that translates to that's the other piece of this. Is one of the things we can't know from the outside is how does that translate to leading an entire team? How does that translate to managing a game? We just have no idea. But if the Seahawks felt positively about that, I'm not opposed to it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think there's something to that. Just football is going to be football, and there's a slow progression of the sport, but you still need to lead people, right? And we've seen players out there, we've seen coaches like Josh McDaniels not be able to do that, right? Who was hypothetically an offensive minded coach, but just be so unable to lead a team. I think that would make me nervous about Shane Waldron. And I just don't think it's going to happen. Like that to me is kind of the main thing. Is I don't see it. I don't see them hiring a Bobby Slovak or a Shane Waldron. I think maybe Ben Johnson, it'll be a conversation. But even then, I really strongly think this is going to be probably closer to the Pete Carroll world. Whether that is frustrating or not, I don't think it's going to be just like a complete 180 degrees from where they were before. They're going to want somebody to help with this transition. So I think we're probably most likely going to end up in that Dan Quinn type of Mike Vrabel type of territory. And that's not saying that I want that to be the case, but just kind of what I expect to be the case. I think we would still have to see how those coaches are leading a team, because the ones who've been successful at it, the people who are offensive minded and have been successful at the NFL level, are people who have NFL level pedigree for a long period of time, which Shane Waldron doesn't have the reputation in the way like Sean McVay. Sean McVay was fucking anointed, right? Kyle Shanahan was anointed. Andy Reid has been there forever.
I mean, I agree with that, and also the nepotism. But Mike McDaniel, I feel like, is an interesting contrast to that.
Mike McDaniel is probably the only one that you can look at. There's still a piece of it where it's kind of like, because of the personality, Mike McDaniel stands out a little bit more, and he's in Miami, where it's like that can fit a little bit more. But even Dan Campbell, right? Dan Campbell is somebody who's like he's a tough football coach type of player. He was an offensive player. He's maybe offensive minded, not even really exactly clear, but
I mean, that is his background. He was an offensive coordinator. Yeah.
He is a football player in a way that Shane Waldron just isn't at the level that Dan Campbell is. So I think I think you almost need one of those factors of the name pedigree, the history, being an offensive player like that. Like, I think that's going to make it easier. It's interesting to me. I mean, I'm not saying that he had a great season in Washington, that Eric Bieniemy is just gone from this conversation. And I do think Eric Bieniemy is somebody who both has the pedigree of being an NFL player, has led Super Bowl winning offenses over multiple seasons, has been very good. I would be excited for him at the very least to get an interview. And it does feel like, I mean, the Chiefs offense, people point to the receivers, and look, maybe Travis Kelce just significantly fell off this season, and the Chiefs receivers were way worse. But I do think Eric Bieniemy won a Super Bowl without Tyreek Hill in Kansas City, and the offense doesn't look that different than it did last year. The defense is better than they were last year, but they still are a worse team overall. So I would like for Eric Bieniemy to be somebody who I feel like can fit that scenario. Ben, before you go, was this the right decision?
It's so hard to answer this without
really hard questions,
without knowing who they're going to hire instead. So,
well, that's how you got to answer it. They don't necessarily know who they're going to hire. I mean, maybe they have someone in mind.
So I'll say yes, because the probability that they hire, again, someone very similar to Pete Carroll is less than 1, even though it does seem very high. But thanks for letting me get off all my takes, and I'll look forward to listening to the rest.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, I mean,
should we talk about Pete Carroll?
Well, let's finish on the coaching search, and then we'll do the Pete Carroll piece of this.
Okay.
You mentioned interviewing Bieniemy. So when the Seahawks went through this process the last time, they did know they were going to hire Pete Carroll. Like, there were other interviews conducted in accordance with the NFL rules to satisfy interviewing minority coaches, but they knew all along Pete Carroll was their guy when they fired Jim Elmora. And it was just a matter of getting that contract done. Again, maybe that's the case with Jim Harbaugh here, and we don't know it. It seems unlikely. And if that's not the case, I want the most exhaustive coaching search possible. Interview everyone. Even if you don't think that they're a good coach, like, it's just good practice to A, talk to these people, and B, learn what they're doing with their other teams. Because one of the things about the Seahawks, and I think this has been for the most part a positive, but they did have brought in some outside coordinators, but it's been the same coach, many of the same members of the coaching staff for 14 years. And there can be a bit of staleness and stagnation in that. And I would like the Seahawks to be aggressive in sort of cherry picking the best ideas from other teams, whether they hire that individual coach or not.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the reason that I thought maybe they should run it back for one more season of Pete Carroll was because I didn't like the coaches who were out there for this particular coaching search season. And I think that they must have had an idea of who they want to bring in before they did this. I don't think they did it and they were just like, Pete Carroll, we are done with you. We have no idea what's next. I think they had a sense of like, we like one of these other people. I mean, we didn't mention Kellen Moore's name, who probably isn't at the scale of being offered a head coaching job. But again, would we be excited about Kellen Moore as the head coach? I think we absolutely would. And I think Kellen Moore has a little bit more of that institutional football piece. He's been an offensive coordinator in a bunch of different places. He's been on a big scale in Dallas, especially. He went to LA, where I think the offense was still good with Kellen Moore prior to the Justin Herbert injury. But it was honestly, Brandon Staley was more closer to a Pete Carroll type situation of a defensive coach who had just had a bad defense. But if it was a combination of, I would be shocked if Shane Waldron was back as offensive coordinator. And I like Shane Waldron, so that would be disappointing. But if it was something like Kellen Moore plus somebody else, to me, I am actually less down on Dan Quinn than I think than maybe Ben is, because Dan Quinn has the institutional knowledge. It'll feel like an extension of Pete Carroll, but also everybody's on notice that this is not like, they're not going to let people get stale and tired here. This team has to win. And they fired Pete Carroll after back-to-back 9-8 seasons. And let's be clear, this was a Pete Carroll fire.
No, they went 10-7, didn't they, the year before?
No, back-to-back 9-8 seasons. So they were 7-10 with Russ the last year, I think. But they fired Pete Carroll after 2 winning seasons, and that is not acceptable. That is not good enough. I'm honestly, at this point, I'm a little shocked and a little impressed with Jody Allen and the Seahawks on a ownership level. They were willing to make this move, because that is a really, really hard move to make. To move on from the head coach who brought you the first Super Bowl in Seahawks history, who went back the next season, who presided over the best tenure in Seahawks history, the best period in Seahawks history. They have both been willing to move on from Russell Wilson and move on from Pete Carroll in that time period. This ownership group, I think we've documented this because of some of the sexism that exists around having a female owner. Like, Jody Allen is doing the fucking thing in a way. I mean, honestly, I guess Tennessee, same thing, right? But like, Jody Allen is doing the thing and saying this isn't good enough, because this is an on the field decision. The team's making money. Everything else is fine. The organization seems fine overall. There's not chaos. They're saying we need to win more in Seattle, and we do not believe what you are doing is helping us do that winning. And the same way that we literally fought about this yesterday, what Pete Carroll was doing as head coach of the Seahawks was not helping them get to the place that they needed to get to and winning another Super Bowl. Because it's amazing what Pete Carroll did in the past and who he was. But at this point, who Pete Carroll was not winning them enough games this year. It wasn't getting them to the playoffs this year. And it wasn't setting them on a path to go win a Super Bowl eventually.
I mean, I still hoped that, as we've talked about in this pod, and as I just alluded to with Harbaugh, that there was that possibility of, hey, let's take everything that Pete Carroll is doing from a leadership perspective and a big picture perspective and convince him to make some incremental changes on defense in particular. And, that's how the team can get where it needs to go. But, it would be interesting to know what those conversations looked like. The fact that this didn't happen the day after suggests to me that it wasn't just about the record and the team performance. It was also about those conversations about the future of the team.
Those things are about the record and the team performance, though.
Those things are
it's all the same.
But like, if you were going to fire Pete Carroll because the Seahawks didn't make the playoffs this year, you would have done it on Monday, not
Pete Carroll.
2 days
Pete
later.
Carroll also deserves a certain level of respect, and
I agree with that, but I don't know that there's
if what you're saying is we are not happy with the on-field results, things need to change in a drastic way, and we need to bring in people, that's still because of the on-field results.
Without question. But what I'm saying is, I think there is probably a scenario where if Pete Carroll had answered those questions differently, he could have kept his job.
Sure, and that's fine. Pete Carroll doesn't need to. Pete Carroll doesn't need this job. Aside from Pete Carroll wanting to literally coach and win forever, Pete Carroll's fine. Pete Carroll has accomplished in his football coaching career more than almost anybody ever. He's a Hall of Fame football coach.
I mean, they had the graphic the other day of, Harbaugh becoming the second coach to win a college football playoff championship and make the Super Bowl. But like Pete Carroll didn't just make the Super Bowl. He won it and went twice. Like he has unassailably the greatest combo college NFL success of any coach in history.
Yeah. Wait, are we talking about Pete Carroll now?
I think we are making that transition. The one thing I did want to say though about ownership is I think another factor in this, besides the sexism, is this sense that Ben sort of mentioned that because of the fact that Jody Allen is the trustee of the Paul Allen Trust, that it's an interim thing, and all indications continue to be that there is no hurry to sell out the Seattle Seahawks or the Portland Trail Blazers, that Jody Allen will continue running these teams for the foreseeable future. So I don't think that's a factor in this decision at all.
Well, the Blazers obviously went through, the last couple of years, similar things to what the Seahawks have gone through. They moved on from their greatest player in franchise history. And, they've kind of turned over the entire team and rebuilt it around a young core. I don't think that's what's going to happen with the Seahawks here. I think the Seahawks actually have done that work. I still, even after this move, we'll see who the next head coach is. I think the roster is still going to look largely the same. I don't think we're going to see like a Pete Carroll style.
Because it's not necessary.
No, it's not. There's a lot of good young talent on this team overall. There could be even more good young talent on the team had they not made some of the moves that they made throughout the season. And I do think that's a little bit part of it, where it's just like, you have, how old is Pete Carroll? 72?
Yes.
You have a 72-year-old head coach. You have to be like, dude, this is not the time to go trade a second-round pick for Leonard Williams. And Pete Carroll,
John Schneider
always
also very much part of those decisions, and John Schneider will be continuing on. Carroll said in his press conference, which is ongoing as we record this, that he will be leading the search for a new coach along with ownership.
John will.
Yeah.
Pete Carroll said that?
John Schneider will, yeah.
But Pete Carroll said that John Schneider will.
Yes.
Wow, how strange. So, I mean, he's obviously going to have some a role within the organization. I mean, that would be part of it, as if it were Dan Quinn who is coming in, somebody who Pete obviously knows well. Dan Quinn is ready to be a head coach in the NFL. Like, and I think he deserves some credit for, was he the one who hired Kyle Shanahan?
I mean, he didn't inherit Kyle Shanahan, so I would assume so.
I mean, maybe him personally, but like, Kyle Shanahan was hired after Dan Quinn was the head coach of the Falcons.
Correct.
He's been to a Super Bowl. He's freaking beat the Seahawks in the playoffs, right? Like, or no, that wasn't Dan Quinn who beat the Seahawks.
No, it was.
Okay. I want to talk about Dan Quinn for a second. Dan Quinn is ready to be a head coach in the NFL again. He's done a couple of things, like literally back to back. If you could think of two better head coaches to be your offensive coordinators than Kyle Shanahan and Steve Sarkisian, like, you have to give him some credit for that, because there aren't that many coaches who under them have had offensive coordinators who are that successful. So if that's something that Dan Quinn is willing to do, which clearly has shown us that he is willing to do, I don't like the idea of a defensive-minded head coach who doesn't have a good defense. At the very least, the Cowboys have a good defense right now.
And I think that Ben is a little bit undercrediting Dan Quinn, because, he's giving a lot of the credit to Micah Parsons as an incredible individual talent, which he is. But also, Micah Parsons wasn't drafted as an edge. Like, that wasn't the plan for him. That wasn't, I don't think it was how he was used at Penn State. That was Dan Quinn who put him in that role and unleashed him to really do what he's done the last couple of seasons. So I do think that he deserves a degree of credit for that. Yeah, Dan Quinn did hire Kyle Shanahan. It was his call. So I agree. I'm not as down on it as Ben is. Should we shift to the Pete Carroll part of this conversation?
Yep.
Look, greatest coach in Seahawks history. I mean, it's tough to compare professional and amateur coaches, but I think you'd probably have to say that he's the greatest professional coach in Seattle sports history. Like, it's him, Lenny Wilkins, Brian Schmetzer, I suppose. I don't know who else is even in that conversation.
Professional coach, is that what you said?
George Carl.
So we're taking out Don James.
Yeah, because it's just different. You coach a college
Kalen
team
DeBoer,
so much longer.
we're taking out. I don't.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Definitely the winningest, but okay. Percentage wise. Yeah, no, I think Pete Carroll is the best coach in Seattle history, period, excluding nobody. And what he has done and achieved with this team, it is impossible to separate it from also having Russell Wilson. But the run that we had as that Seahawks team for 5 or 6 years, it was the most fun being a fan of a professional sports team that I've ever had in my entire life. And having week after week, especially for kind of the 3 main seasons or 4 main seasons, right? Where it was there was the beginning, Russell Wilson's rookie year, there was the Super Bowl again, and then the next year where they were actually better than those previous 3 teams. Like those 4 seasons were the most fun being a sports fan, excluding excluding Ken Griffey Jr., the Sonics run, anything like that. Like that was the most fun that it was being a sports fan, not professional, not college, sports in general in the city of Seattle. It was fucking incredible, right? Like it was amazing to see those personalities, to see those players, to have Pete Carroll on the sideline. He is so good and he was so excellent at doing that piece of what he needed to do. He assembled the defense. He built the team up. He handled everything very, very well. He handled Russell Wilson, the beginning of Russell Wilson's career, very, very well as well. He was willing to install him as the starting quarterback, as a 3rd round pick right out of the gate. Like Pete Carroll did many amazing things during that time period, and that's why he's easily, to me, the best coach in Seattle history.
Yeah, and he still leaves the organization a good place because of the Russell Wilson trade. And they did resist some degree of temptation to try to immediately pivot back into success. Obviously, the Leonard Williams trade was frustrating given the timing of that one and the way things worked out. But yeah, I mean, it's funny. I said that you have to separate professional and amateur coaches because a coach can have so much longer tenures at the college level, and they have so much more influence. But in many ways the Seahawks were like a college program because of the continuity that they had with Pete Carroll over the last 14 years. And you think about the alumni that have been involved here, and even players who parted on bad terms like Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman, and even to a degree Bobby Wagner, with the way that his release was handled, coming back to the organization. And the fact that you've had this direct line where Richard Sherman is helping coach up Rick Woolen, or, giving him advice and that sort of thing. And Michael Bennett with Boye Mafe and Jenna Nwosu and so on and so forth. Like that's been an awesome part of being a Seahawks fan, and is a huge credit to Pete Carroll and the culture that he's built. And like, I don't believe in everything about Pete Carroll's philosophy, obviously. The 4th downs, the lack of, I think the lack of willingness to see where things were going wrong, the perpetual optimism. But win forever, like I actually think is an amazing outlook for a coach. And there are so many things that, not just in terms of my vision for what a coach is, but like even the way I live my own life has been influenced by the win forever
You're winning
philosophy.
forever. No, I mean, Pete Carroll, both an amazing coach and an amazing person, and a person who felt proud to represent the city of Seattle. I think it was time. And I think eventually, I don't want to say that the game passed Pete Carroll by, because I don't know if that's exactly it, but people probably do underestimate aging curves with coaches, and they assume that coaches are going to be exactly the same forever. I think Pete Carroll really fully understood where football was a decade ago. And at this point, football's moved, and football is in a different place than it was 10 years ago. And part of that means that the things, Pete Carroll, he did a good enough job in having more of a motion offense, but it was never fully there. And he still relied a little bit too much on the run, still was willing to draft running backs too high, still wasn't great on 4th down decisions. In fact, I think because that Steelers game moved to one of the worst in the league in 4th down decisions this year, he learned at certain times. But ultimately, where Pete Carroll was, there are coaches who are half his age Ben Johnson is younger than I am. Ben Johnson is, I believe, exactly half of Pete Carroll's age. So it's a significant difference in the kind of football you're talking about. He's not talking about like Bud Adams, and those aren't the touchstones for Ben Johnson. He's the type of coach who's just kind of entering his prime. And I think for Pete Carroll, this is the perfect time for him to move on. He's leaving after 2 winning seasons. He doesn't have to have the 4-12 season or whatever like Mike Holmgren had at the very, very end, right? Pete Carroll managed to leave as much as possible on his own terms, having overseen the greatest run in Seattle sports history. It's an extraordinarily impressive thing what he accomplished. He's number 1. There's no Mount Rushmore. It is Pete Carroll on his own.
Four photos of Pete Carroll. Ben Johnson is 37 for the record. Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting contrast, though, in what you're saying is Bill Belichick in New England. Like the guy who succeeded Pete Carroll amusingly, as well as beat him in Super Bowl 49. But despite everything that the Patriots accomplished in Bill Belichick's tenure, like assuming it ends this offseason, it's going to end in some degree of disgrace based on the way that this season went and the way that relationships have been broken there. So Pete Carroll is not doing that. This is amicable. This is it's a sad day, but it's also a happy day to commemorate that everything that Pete Carroll accomplished as head coach of the Seahawks and what he brought to Seattle.
I think that is absolutely it. This is a day to celebrate Pete Carroll, not to think about what could have been, and not to. I think a lot of people are like mad at the organization. I think the organization kind of did Pete Carroll a little bit of a favor here also by just, you have to know when to call it. I mean, you talk about, you tell me about Pop in San Antonio, but sometimes you can overstay your welcome, and sometimes you can tarnish your legacy a little bit. That's not going to happen to Pete Carroll at all. Pete Carroll's legacy is still going to be amazing. He's the guy who traded Russell Wilson and got the team back to the playoffs the very next year. I don't think he was going to win a Super Bowl with this roster or with this scheme, and I think it made sense for this to be the year that Pete Carroll moves on. But at the same time, to be able to move to a different part of the organization after the season that he had, it's an amazing thing for Pete Carroll. So I love Pete Carroll. Any complaints that we had about him have never been about Pete Carroll personally, and have only explicitly been on the field. And I think that this is happening at the exact right time. So it's a celebratory day to me. And also, like, there's a reality to this of football is supposed to be fun. Pete Carroll made football fun over and over and over again. And that's especially what we have to celebrate Pete Carroll for. Everything he did, Pete Carroll made football fun. He was fun to have on the sidelines. I hope that whomever comes next, that we love to just see them. I don't want to Matt Eberflus or whatever. Like, we don't want to have to be like, that's the freaking coach. We've been very blessed in the city of Seattle to go from Mike Holmgren to Pete Carroll in the same way that at UW we were able to go from Chris Peterson to Kalen DeBoer. There were blips in between there, but to have a couple of legendary coaches back to back is an amazing thing. And the organization is in such a good place that we can have these conversations about any head coach. There is no head coach who is off limits. The Seattle Seahawks, to me, is probably you could weigh it between the Chargers. They're still the Chargers. They don't have a fan base. Like, they're in LA. They have Justin Herbert, but they don't have a fan base. I think this is the number one job on the market. And what Pete Carroll has done, and what Mike Holmgren did, and the organization in general, and just being so steady as an organization, means that they can go talk to any coach in the world. It's not far-fetched to have a conversation about Jim Harbaugh, who probably is the hottest coaching candidate. I don't even really know how to balance that, but they could have a conversation with anybody because of where this organization is, and because of the talent that's on the roster and how consistent they've been. So I think Pete Carroll has done an incredible service to the Seahawks and the city of Seattle.
I mean, we'll see if Pete Carroll eventually doesn't coach, because again, the slogan is win forever. And I was going back through my Pete Carroll emails to see if I could find anything that I had written when the Seahawks first hired him, which sadly I didn't. But my first reference to the idea of Pete Carroll actually believing that he could live and coach forever predates the Pelton cast. It was from August 2013. So maybe someday he will not coach and he will come back and be part of that, group of people coming back, that organization. And I hope that's the case, and we'll celebrate everything that Pete Carroll accomplished here. So
yeah, a great day to celebrate what Pete Carroll brought us for a period of these last 15 years. The greatest heights in Seahawks history, some of the most fun games. Literally, if you ask me most fun games in Seahawks history, it's all the Pete Carroll era. Like there's maybe a small handful before then, but he's both the coach forever and had some of the most fun games. When you look back at it, you have the Tip winning the Super Bowl, the next conference championship game after
Beastquake?
The Beastquake in his first season, but also just the weekly battles, playing against the Texans and Deshaun Watson, playing against the Steelers in those games, the game at Baltimore where Thomas Rawls, I think, ended up getting injured, but that time period, beating the Niners so many times over and over and over again. Thanksgiving Day, beating the Niners, Pete Carroll. The one in Russ's rookie year, beating the Niners on December 23rd or whatever, when it was just this is it. We're the best team on the face of the earth. In fact, I was talking with Zach Chabal at his birthday party a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how it's such a fun moment when you know that you have the best team and then they back it up on the field. because that almost never happens. You almost never like, we here understand this thing that I feel like nobody else gets. And then I'm sure this is how Baltimore's feeling right now. They're going out there and they're not just winning these games, they are destroying the 49ers. Like that Seahawks team from that era, that 3-4 year period was so much fun to watch. And they fucking talked their shit and they backed it up and they beat teams badly. They crushed Peyton Manning in the Super Bowl and they should have won 2 in a row. So what Pete Carroll could have accomplished is extraordinarily impressive, but just having a team at that level that you knew was so good and then backed it up, nobody can do that. And to have Pete Carroll presiding over it with just a little bit of cockiness, like Pete Carroll was such an amazing coach to lead that team and to let those personalities shine. It was never about Pete Carroll. It was always about the players, and he let them be them. He's an awesome coach.
All right. On that note, we'll obviously have plenty of continuing coverage of the Seahawks coaching search. I think once they have a head coach, we'll do sort of the state of the team annual postseason piece with Ben Baldwin. It didn't feel right to do it now, and probably not during the midst of this search. But on that note, thanks for listening.
Thanks for Devin Witherspoon and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Thanks, Pete.
All right.
Who do you, I really have no idea who I want. Ben Johnson.
I'm willing within certain bounds to trust the team on this one.
I just don't want Mike Vrabel. I think Jim Harbaugh would be really incredible.
It would be funny
to have also in the NFC again. Like after, I feel like it like would take away some of the sting of the national championship game if we hired Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah, unless Michigan hired Kalen DeBoer as his replacement.
Yeah,
which I don't think they're gonna do. But then
we'd have to hire Jesse Minter.
It's not like Harbaugh's not coming to the NFL anyway.
We're just gonna keep going back and forth arms race. We already got Courtney Morgan.
Is this like when the Seahawks signed Nate Burleson to the poison pill offer sheet?
Yeah, you know what I think? I think the Vikings won that one.
I think so too.
I feel like it's. I think there's a strong possibility. Just seeing that Dan Quinn name be thrown around right away.
Oh, it seems like the most likely outcome.
But I would love Kellen Moore, or even I wouldn't be shocked if Dan Quinn
hired Kellen Moore.
Well, hired Kellen Moore, but also kept Shane Waldron too.
Yeah, plausible.
Dan Quinn, he knows good coordinators. When Sark retires, bitch, bring him back.